If you're now in a context where, there's this massive strike of 350,000 workers and they're able to win the gains that they are fighting for, then all of a sudden you see people do that. Like, that's a thing. That happens. Maybe that's not so unrealistic in my case. That's the kind
Most of us work, and most of us toil, and yet not most of us, not yet at least, look around and see that our struggles to put food on the table, to provide shelter for our families, to stay healthy without going into crippling debt, could be collective, and together we could thrive. But that could change. Upsurges of collective struggle, by definition, come in bursts. And when the conditions are ripe, all you may need is a spark to ignite the flame. Hello, my name is Teddy Ostro. Welcome to the Upsurge, a podcast about UPS, the Teamsters, and the future of the American labor movement. This podcast unpacks the unprecedented labor fight this year at UPS. In July, the contract of over 340,000 UPS workers will expire. And if those workers strike, which is a real possibility, it will be the largest strike against a single company in U.S. history. In this episode, we dig into, the upsurge, or realistically, the potential for a labor upsurge here in the United States. By upsurge, we mean a tremendous amount of labor activity, organizing new unions, signing up new members to existing unions, and lots of strikes. We're talking millions and millions of people joining unions and hitting the picket line. That isn't happening. But in the last few years, something has been in the air when it comes to labor. It may have started in 2018, when teachers across the South launched massive strikes, demanding more for themselves, for their students, in what has been called the Red State Revolt. Or it might have been the COVID-19 pandemic that really set things off. The death, the disease, and the disrespect from corporations exposed the lie that we live to work, rather than work to live. And a lot more people began to recognize that we can change our working conditions together, against the will of our bosses. Labor unions are emerging yet again as the vehicle for workers to advance their lives and livelihoods. To explore this complex and exciting labor moment, we spoke with Barry Eidlin, Associate Professor of Sociology at McGill University. Barry studies class, labor, politics, and social movements. He's an expert on the decline of labor in North America, but he's also got his finger on the pulse of its potential resurgence. Much focus in mainstream media has been on the organizing of new unions. And if you're unfamiliar with the labor movement, you still probably heard all the ruckus about workers forming unions at Amazon, at Starbucks, at Apple, and other companies once thought unorganizable. But a huge piece of this, which has gone a bit under the radar for non-labor folks, is the reformation of some of the U.S.'s biggest and most powerful legacy unions. Fed up with business unionism, new, more militant union activists are ousting complacent leaders who've driven their unions into the ground. That includes, of course, the Teamsters, but it also includes another union, which just saw a sea change in its leadership. That's the United Auto Workers, the UAW. Barry and I got to talk about the changes there as well. And these changes, it's kind of what our whole podcast is about. If you hadn't noticed, there's a pun in our name. But we also named this show The Upsurge because this labor fight we're focusing on at UPS could be a catalyst for a lot more activity across the labor movement. And we want to cover this labor battle almost like mainstream media covers a run-up to an election. It's crucial that people know the stakes before Election Day. Now, before we get into the interview, I apologize. This is going to be a slightly longer introduction than other shows, but I have to make an important and exciting announcement. As of this episode, The Upsurge is officially produced in partnership with In These Times magazine. If you're listening to this show and you don't know In These Times, throw off your headphones right now and go read online or in print one of the best magazines for progressive politics, and in particular, the labor movement. And that, of course, includes what's going on with the UPS Teamsters campaign. The Upsurge and In These Times will be working side by side over the next several months to cover arguably the most important labor story of our generation. This is sort of a soft launch of this partnership. You'll be hearing more from In These Times soon. But for me personally, this is a dream come true. For the podcast, we are thrilled to be welcoming likely many more ears. And if you're a new listener, thank you for joining us. We have a little something we think you'd like to know. The Upsurge is a listener-funded podcast. We don't take ad money. We don't exist without your support. And In These Times is now offering a generous and truly fantastic offer. The first 50 people to become supporters of our Patreon following the publication of this episode will receive a free annual subscription to the magazine. That's right, if you head over to patreon.com/upsurgepod and become a patron, you will get free In These Times, one of the best magazines out there, for a year. In addition, depending on the tier of your patronage, you will receive extra content from us, like show notes or even bonus episodes. But best of all, you'll keep the show going. Find the link to our Patreon in the description and check In These Times out at inthesetimes.com. Now, because a lot of you may be new to the podcast, we thought it'd be a good idea to catch you up with a short recap. In our inaugural episode, we spoke to a rank-and-file UPSer at Teamsters Local 804, Antoine Andrews, and Teamsters organizer, former 804 rank-and-filer, Tony Rosario. With them, we set the stage for the podcast, explained the basics of the contract campaign by the Teamsters at UPS, and of course, set the stakes for the workers.
Growing up in this company, I was told by these seasoned drivers that we have a start time, no finish time. Don't make any plans. You know, there are drivers who I've heard throughout the years complain about not being able to see their children grow up, because when they leave the house early in the morning, kids are sleeping. And upon their return, the kids are in bed.
In our second episode, we rewound into history and looked at the last strike of generational significance. And that, of course, was the national strike at UPS, but in 1997.
One of the key backdrops to the contract campaign and the eventual strike was that it resonated so well with the overall feeling of working class Americans that something had to be done, that people should not have to be always working under such stressful conditions. So it kind of hit a nerve, I think, that really resonated with the public.
Finally, in the third and fourth episodes of the podcast, we spoke to rank-and-filers from around the country to try to paint a picture of what it's actually like to be a UPSer. We took a step inside the warehouse with UPS part-timers, also known as members of the silent majority of the company.
Across the nation, the biggest issue for part-timers is pay.
This pay is just it's poverty pay. I know members that lived on the street until they could get their feet underneath them.
Then we hit the road with package car drivers, the face of UPS, and learned about how UPS is dividing the workforce with a tiered wage system, a cancer for any union.
Well, the pressure is to get rid of the 22-4 altogether, which would make everyone a regular package car driver.
The injustice of doing the exact same job as someone else and getting paid less for it, having less benefits, having less rights on the job is very clear.
But we also captured how UPSers are fighting for a better contract and preparing to strike if they need to.
Who wouldn't want a voice on their contract for their future? You know, so that's where I'm getting at. What is your why and what you come to work every day? Mine is my family. So yes, I do want to be involved. I do want to know the ins and outs of my job, what can and what can't hurt me.
I also thought we'd give a short preview of what's to come. My co-producer Ruby Walsh and I, we just got back from Teamsters Local 25 in Boston, where we got to meet the president of the Teamsters Union, Sean O'Brien.
When should we expect a strike vote at the local level?
Can't give you all the secrets, man.
I'd ask.
Can't give you all the secrets, yeah?
Thank you.
Like, you're going to fight. You don't tell the guy you're going to punch him, do you? Yeah, the white.
True, it's true. Fair.
What's up, brother?
I encourage you to go back and listen to our previous shows, but it's not strictly necessary. Now, my interview with Barry Eidlin. He is the author of Labor and the Class Idea in the United States and Canada, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. He actually worked at the union reform organization, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, in the 2000s before becoming an academic. And among other projects, he is working on a book about the transformation of the Teamsters Union. Barry Eidlin, thanks for joining me on the Upsurge.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I want to start with a couple things. First being, what the heck is happening? Are we experiencing a labor upsurge? What even is a labor upsurge? And because I know you know your history, maybe help us understand this moment in the grand scheme of labor history.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would be hesitant to call what we're in right now an upsurge. We definitely are in some sort of an uptick. We're definitely in a different place than we were, let's say, 5 years ago. If you look at just the interest in unions, the increase in unionization campaigns, the increase in strike rates, those kinds of things, the public approval of unions, these are all things that are on the upswing in a way that we haven't seen for quite some time. But it's important to keep that upswing in perspective. So, for example, the National Labor Relations Board issued a press release earlier this year where they talked about a 50% increase in National Labor Relations Board union elections over the past year. And that's great, but if we look back historically, that gets us back to rates we saw in like the early 2010s or something like that, right? Hardly a high watermark for labor insurgency, and just not anywhere in the same league as we saw in the mid 20th century, right? Similarly with strikes, the level of strikes was something about a fifth or a sixth of what we saw in 2018, right, which was the Red State Revolt year with the teachers' strikes. And even there, even if we were able to sort of consistently have as many strikes as we did in 2018, we would be seeing strike levels that we saw in the late Reagan era, right? Which is, again, not exactly a high watermark for labor militancy and for workers getting a decent share. So it's important to have some historical perspective. Now, obviously, the movement is in the right direction, and that's the important thing. And beyond the data, there is clearly some energy, right? I mean, it's maybe some Gen Zers would call it the vibes. There's a vibe shift or something. I need to keep on trend with my students. That's hard to put your finger on, but is something that's definitely real if you talk to organizers, right? There's just a much more readiness to think about unions as a potential solution to people's problems. And that, I think, is something that is both hard to measure, but also very real and also very helpful. One thing particularly important about the timing of all of this is that you have the UPS contract expiring on July 31st. The big three auto contracts expire on September 15th. So if you think about the way that labor, growth happens, it's not a linear process. It's not just sort of steady growth year to year, or it's upsurges, right? And so you usually can't predict labor upsurges. That's sort of part of what makes them upsurges, is that they're not very predictable. But you can forecast conditions that are conducive to upsurge. And the fact that you've got a potential strike of 350,000 UPS workers across the country coming up in August, followed by 100,000 or so auto workers in September certainly creates some momentum for that kind of process to unfold.
Something you've written about, some of the specific conditions that make this maybe not an upsurge per se, but certainly a labor moment. One of those is that we're seeing worker-led organizing. And I don't know if everyone completely understands who's listening to this podcast why that is unique, at least in recent history, right? We saw at Starbucks, we have this union, which is affiliated with SEIU, right? Workers United, simply kind of on the back end as workers in small shops across the country taking charge.
The historic movement began when a single Starbucks store in Buffalo, New York, voted to unionize in December. Now, 200 stores have filed for union elections, covering over 5,000 workers in at least 30 states.
Then at Amazon and Trader Joe's, we saw independent unions.
And we went for the top dog because we want every other industry, every other business to know that things have changed. We going to unionize. We're not going to quit our jobs anymore. To the first union in American history.
Can you pick apart for us what we're seeing differently right now than the recent past?
A connecting thread for a lot of this stuff is that where we're seeing action is with these worker-led unions, whether they are independent or part of smaller unions, or just these affiliates of larger unions. And, historically, when we see periods of labor upsurge, where labor really grows by leaps and bounds, that's an essential component, right? If you look at the 30s with the organization of basic industry, or the 1960s with the organization of the public sector, that worker-led component is essential.
1936 and 1937 were years in which the crest of reaction broke in 1,000 places. Hotel workers, department store workers, hospital employees, even elevator operators who called sit-down strikes between floors. Every trade and occupation joined the parade, but not all the strikes were won.
And so you have these unions that are just sort of taking off, and just by workers are taking matters into their own hands and organizing just on their own. The book that I wrote on comparing the US and Canada, I mean, there's an interesting episode because Canada sort of lagged behind the US in a lot of ways. And the big thing in the 1930s was the formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which didn't exist in Canada. The Canadian workers were still stuck with the old Trades and Labor Congress, which was affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, the sort of conservative craft-based union. And so what happened in Canada was that people just started organizing and then saying they were CIO. They didn't call DC to ask for a charter or something like that. They just started calling themselves the CIO, and that's just indicative of a sort of broader trend. Right? I mean, that's sort of one funny story perhaps, but that's sort of an instance of this broader trend of where workers just sort of take things into their own hands. And that's something we haven't seen in several decades, right? I would probably say going back at least to the 1970s, I think the public sector upsurge, right? And we need to understand that that's partially due to circumstances that are far beyond workers' control, in the sense that it's these sort of broader economic shifts that make it just a lot less hospitable to mass organizing. Some of it's self-inflicted, right? Some of it is unions that forget how to fight. But there are these sort of macroeconomic forces that are working against worker organizing as well. And so what was going on during that downturn is that, you had people who cared a lot about unions, who cared a lot about, rebuilding labor, trying to think through what are some ways to revive labor's fortunes. And a lot of the solutions involved these sort of staff-led initiatives, right? They come in for a lot of criticism, and I'm critical of a lot of these staff-led developments as well. But you have to understand the broader context in which these are happening, where this idea of sort of an organic working class upsurge just doesn't seem like a real possibility. And so people come up with these ideas about sort of coming up with strategic research campaigns, or you come up with, policy reforms, right? And, these are limited, but I think that, you can certainly point to some very real gains that you can't just sort of dismiss as, bankrupt top-down approaches, right? I mean, I think like the biggest example of this would be the Fight for 15.
Now, fast food workers demanding to be paid more. Today, McDonald's employees across the country held rallies. They want minimum wage to be increased to $15 an hour. Here in the
which was in no way a worker-led campaign. It's very much a sort of top-down, sort of policy-driven approach, accentuated by some fairly symbolic strikes that weren't really strikes, that were more just sort of protests with a few workers sprinkled in for good measure. But despite those shortcomings, you have to credit it with transforming the idea of like a $15 minimum wage from something that was a pipe dream when it was first proposed to a reality in many parts of the country, right? So limited, yes, but real. The broader point, though, is that for the past 30 or so years, the approach was the way we revive labor's fortunes is by, hiring better organizers, devoting more resources to organizing, developing strategic campaigns, that kind of thing. And it was missing that key ingredient of, worker-led organizing. So now we are in a moment where the idea of worker-led organizing is a real thing that we can actually look out in the world, in the here and now, and see happening. And that, I think, is a crucial difference between what we're seeing now and what we've seen for the past 40 or 50 years in terms of organizing. It's an essential part of any possibility of what we're seeing now escalating into something bigger.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into some of those things you just mentioned, and then perhaps we can unfold what's a little bit more under the radar, at least right now, and perhaps most relevant to the Teamsters, the transformation of existing largely powerful unions by reform movements within those unions, and how this all connects back to UPS, the UPS contract campaign, and its broader implications. You write about, in a Jacobin article, about institutionalizing insurgency. The big institutions of labor aren't these independent unions, at least yet. They are these larger unions, certainly diminished unions, but these powerful, big labor organizations from history that still exist today. What place do those reform movements and just transforming existing unions, what does that have in this labor moment and in the potential for broader labor upsurge?
Yeah. No, that's a really important question. So this concept of institutionalizing insurgency is something I've played around with for a while, and it's a really tricky concept, but I think it's vitally important for any kind of understanding of what it takes to actually build a stronger labor movement. And it starts from two conflicting principles. On the one hand, you need that bottom-up energy. You need the worker-led organizing. You need the movement part of the labor movement for labor to have a future. That's really the engine that drives things. At the same time, you need a way to consolidate your gains. You can't just be reinventing the wheel every few years, right? So you need to be able to consolidate the gains that you get through organizing and fighting so that you can fight for more things, right? And that requires organization. Now, then organization by definition involves some sort of, bureaucratization. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing that there's a bureaucracy to ensure that you have your paycheck every week or something like that. There are certain things that you just can they just operate on their own, right? So it's good that you have certain rules and regulations in place that you can enforce via some sort of organization, right? But the problem is that, organization requires a certain degree of stability, and the bottom-up energy that is the sort of lifeblood of the labor movement is potentially a destabilizing effect, right? And so you need both the destabilizing effect of bottom-up militancy and the stabilizing effect of organization to have a healthy movement, in a sense. So that's sort of what I'm trying to get at with institutionalizing insurgency. And so where do these reform movements come in? In my understanding of how this works, they are sort of this glue that sort of helps to keep the insurgency and the institutionalization in place. They're operating within the framework of existing unions. They're helping people navigate the organization, the bureaucracy, but they're organizing people from the bottom up to mobilize, to fight, even in cases where sometimes it might not be what the organization wants, and in some cases can involve actually fighting that bureaucracy. And so they are this sort of vital link that connects this sort of militant organizing from the bottom up and the sort of structures of the union that are essential for safeguarding existing gains and building on them.
Well, let's return to the Teamsters for a second. Part of the reason why there's so much potential right now is, as you mentioned, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, is the continued organizing of groups like Teamsters for a Democratic Union.
I think that this is a critical piece to understand what's going on right now. Teamsters for a Democratic Union is a rank and file group that dates back to 1976 that I believe you've covered in previous episodes, but it's been this sort of reform force in the union for decades and played a crucial role both in winning the right to vote in 1989 and then getting the first democratically elected president elected, Ron Kerry, who, of course, as you did cover in a previous episode, was the leader of the 97 UPS strike.
Where I'm coming from is this union is about the membership, the forgotten people, good contracts, decent pensions, having union officers go into the office there and represent the members.
And then there was a setback. Hoffa Jr. came to power, and TDU kept at it and kept rebuilding. And that laid the groundwork for the O'Brien-Zuckerman victory in 2021.
And I'll say this. When you come to the fight with organized labor, if you are corporate America and you want to take us on, or you're a crooked, corruptible politician, put your helmets on, buckle your chin straps. It's a full contact sport.
Because we hold greedy CEOs like yourself accountable.
You're calling me a greedy CEO?
Oh, yeah, you are. You want to attack my salary, I'll attack yours.
You would not have the O'Brien-Zuckerman victory without TDU. And so that decades of spade work, organizing at the grassroots, laid the groundwork for this reform coalition to come to power that is poised to, as you've been tracking on this podcast, potentially lead one of the most transformative strikes in U.S. labor history.
What would it mean if the Teamsters strike? And maybe if they don't strike, they get a good contract. What does that actually mean?
You've emphasized this several times in your show that the UPS strike would be, by my counting, I think the sixth largest strike in U.S. history and the largest one against a single employer ever. So just by its sheer size, it would dwarf recent strike statistics just in one fell swoop. But by virtue of the fact that it's 350,000 workers, by definition in every zip code in the United States, is going to put labor struggle and class conflict into the public eye in a way that we haven't seen probably since the 1997 UPS strike. But it's going to be in the public eye in a way, in a context that's very different from 1997. A strike of that magnitude happening in the context that we're seeing now is just going to put the idea of striking, and especially, if it's successful, of striking and winning in the consciousness of many more people, right? Where that's just going to be part of the potential repertoire of action that people face when they, because I think that people sort of go through their lives thinking of all the, if you talk to people, they have a lot of concerns about, their life, about making ends meet, about feeding their families, about spending time with their families, about, just having some time to themselves, about getting ground down at work, about not getting paid enough, about having problems with their health care. The list goes on, right? Many people experience these things, but for the most part, don't do much about them, either just accept them or try to make do with individual solutions, like try to find another job or, negotiate with their boss or something like that. Because the idea of a broader collective solution to those problems is just not on their radar screen, right? It's not because they're dumb. It's not because they're uninformed. It's not that they don't understand that they have these problems. It's just that that solution doesn't seem like a real possibility. So if you're now in a context where, there's this massive strike of 350,000 workers and they're able to win the gains that they are fighting for, then all of a sudden you see like, people do that. Like that's a thing. That happens. Maybe that's not so unrealistic in my case. And that's the kind of real shift in consciousness through a material shift in the reality on the ground, right? Not through people having some moment of enlightenment, but rather just seeing that, strikes work, that can convince more people to engage in that kind of collective action. And that can have a snowballing effect, right?
So now it isn't only the Teamsters where we're seeing reform, right? There's a movement brewing currently at the UFCW that is food and commercial workers. But we really couldn't do this episode without talking about the United Auto Workers Union. This reform movement, Unite All Workers for Democracy, UAWD, it was directly inspired by TDU. And they openly say that they were participating in sort of helping them. Why is it important that rank and file are taking control of the union?
The UAW abandoned organizing in the auto industry decades ago. That's, I think, the first thing to state. I think that it's important to understand that the standard rhetoric about manufacturing is that it's gone in the US and everything went to Mexico or went to China. And that's certainly the case in some industries, but it's definitely not the case in the auto industry. Rather, what happened is the industry was de-unionized, and the industry either moved down south to the right-to-work states in the South, or sometimes just down the street to a subcontractor that is non-union, right? And so there are currently more auto workers in the United States than there were 40 years ago in 1983, right? So in 2023, there are actually more auto workers than there were in 1983. There's 1/6 of the union membership, though, right? So there's this explosion of non-unionized auto workers. And obviously you can see that sort of has some undesirable effects on wages and working conditions when you go from an industry where the union contract essentially sets the standard to a industry where the non-union competition essentially sets the standard. The union's response to the anti-union backlash starting in the 70s and accelerating in the 80s, and the challenge from foreign automakers was to basically throw itself on the mercy of the company and basically pursue a strategy of labor management partnership and cooperation instead of continuing its fighting tradition.
Across the Detroit River at GM World headquarters, company chairman Roger Smith is determined to use the upcoming negotiations to radically alter labor management relations at GM.
I think it makes the jobs more interesting. It makes, when you make a contribution to anything, you feel better about it, I think.
Sure.
There, put it on there, didn't it? Yeah.
One of Smith's priorities is a profit-sharing wage scheme that is intended to force workers to share economic risks with management. In good times, workers get generous bonuses. In bad times, their wages shrink. The new American contract signals the end of guaranteed annual hourly wage increases.
The problem I see is the whole direction they're proposing, not the amount. I think it's just the direction the corporation wants to take. And I think it's trying to set a stage for the future.
And that has been disastrous for the union. It's led to mass layoffs, plant closings, erosion of contracts, living standards. They used to be fighting for a 32-hour day, and then in the last contract, the current UAW leaders were signing off on, 7 by 12-hour shifts. So there's this sort of contract concessions embedded in this logic of labor management partnership that then ultimately devolved into just rank outright corruption, just literally taking payoffs for summer homes and, expensive cigars and, just the worst caricatures of union boss corruption that a union busting consultant could come up with.
Okay, developing right now, the feds have made it to the top. After months of investigating, former UAW President Gary Jones has been charged in the corruption scandal that's rocked the union. Federal prosecutors say Jones played a key role to funnel more than $1 million from the union,
including everything from lavish trips to tens of thousands of dollars in alcohol and expensive cigars.
Which is really, historically speaking, quite shocking, because the UAW was not an outright corrupt union in the way that the Teamsters was, right? So corruption was something that really sort of infiltrated the union at a later date, and it's directly related to this strategy of labor management partnership. In any case, as a result of that corruption scandal, there was going to be a government takeover of the union, essentially. There was a lawsuit similar to what was filed against the Teamsters in the late 1980s. And part of the settlement of that was the union agreeing to a referendum that would allow the members to decide if they want to switch to a one member, one vote direct election of top union officers, which they overwhelmingly did a year ago. And that set the stage for the election late last year.
The convention is about voting for candidates to run for top union jobs, who will then be voted on by all union members by mail later this year. What has been called one member, one vote.
It's wonderful for the members because now the power's in their hands and they can decide whatever they want.
And that pit, the UAWD, United Auto Workers for Democracy slate, which was only a partial slate. They couldn't even come up with a full slate to challenge all spots on the International Executive Board because it's a small fledgling grassroots organization that is just a few years old, right? I mean, they've really been, fighting hard, but they just had limited resources, limited capacity. So they did what they could. They put up these candidates. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that, as valiantly as they were fighting, a few people thought that they stood a chance. I mean, I think they thought it was important to put forth candidates to contest the election, to move the democratic process forward in the union. But in terms of actually winning power in the union, I don't think many people thought that was on the agenda. But when offered the choice for the first time to select their leaders, members opted for the reform slate. And so every single slot that UAWD contested, they won. And the most recent was the new president, Sean Fain, just won, and he was just sworn in yesterday, Sunday, March 26th.
We've just witnessed the four most powerful words of democracy. The people have spoken. Now, we're here to come together to ready ourselves for the war against our only one and only true enemy, multi-billion-dollar corporations and employers that refuse to give our members their fair share.
Well, Barry, you've been so generous with your time. I want to ask you one final question. What do you think we need to see for there to be a labor upsurge? What are the conditions? What are the tasks? What are the obstacles? If you could just do it
you could just design it yourself? What needs to happen?
I mean, we need more. I mean, that's like the short version. We just need a hell of a lot more organizing, a hell of a lot more striking, a hell of a lot more winning big contracts. I mean, I think my vision of how this would unfold is something along the lines of you have these strikes that sort of reach a certain tipping point at which more people sort of realize like, oh, we should be doing this too. And that sort of spills over into other industries and takes on a life of its own. And then you sort of have that dynamic that kicks into gear, like what you saw in the 1930s and the 1960s. Ultimately, I mean, I think, Amazon needs to be part of that picture. It is the General Motors of the 2020s in the sense that as goes Amazon, so goes the rest of corporate America. They're sort of setting the pace. And so actually bringing Amazon to heel and, organizing it and, turning Amazon work into sustainable work, both humanly and environmentally sustainable, is a critical part of the equation. But it needs to go far beyond that. There needs to be new models for how do we balance, these new models of flexible work and employment security, right? So, if we're going to sort of have a platform economy, what are ways of sort of reorganizing the platform economy that actually doesn't subject workers to mass precarity, right? That sort of mass insecurity and sort of poverty wages. How do we expand organizing in academia and make sure that the people who, make the university work actually have decent wages and working conditions and actually have a say in the educational mission of the institutions, right? So I think that it can have these broader spillover effects, which again, replicates a lot of what we saw in earlier decades, right? Where these labor upsurges don't just result in stronger contracts that provide better wages and working conditions, but really shift a culture, right? The labor movements of these periods, they would form softball leagues, right? They would have community theater groups. They would have radio stations. So they really had a way of shifting not just the political discourse, but the entire culture in a way where sort of collective solutions to common problems just made more sense. And sort of public engagement just made more sense. And so I think that that's really what we can see coming out of that kind of broader upsurge.
Barry Eidlin, thanks for coming on the Upsurge.
Thanks for having me.
You just listened to our interview with Barry Eidlin on the Upsurge. I had a lot of fun talking to Barry, and I just want to state that we didn't get into everything that we had hoped. There's a lot to cover about the potential upsurge of labor. That includes how the legal environment appears to be less hostile right now for labor unions, and that includes the triumphant repeal of right to work in Michigan recently. There's also the upsurge specifically among higher education workers in the United States, which is truly remarkable. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to cover these and a lot more, but perhaps we can have Barry back on the show at some point. Maybe we'll do some bonus episodes, but I'll drop some extra links in the show notes about these topics. The Upsurge is produced in partnership with In These Times, a nonprofit magazine that covers the labor movement closely. Check them out at inthesetimes.com, where you can also find an archive of all our past episodes. You can also show support by sharing the episode on social media, giving us a 5-star rating, and writing a review. Follow us on Twitter at UpsurgePod and Facebook, The Upsurge. You can also listen to us on our YouTube channel, The Upsurge. But the best way you can show your support is by becoming a patron of the show at patreon.com/UpsurgePod. We are listener supported and can't continue without you. You can find a link in the description. Thank you to those who are already patrons, but a very special thank you and shout out to our patrons at the business agent tier or higher. Yoni Golochov, Jason Cohn, Jason Mendez, Richard Hooker, Tony Winters, David Allen, Justin Allo, Tim Peppers, Dan Arlen, Dimitri Legas, Juliet Kang, Rand Wilson, Randy Ostro, Mac Hardin, and Timothy Kruger. All your support means so much. The podcast was edited by myself. It was produced by NYGP and Ruby Walsh. Music is by Casey Gallagher. The cover art was done by Devlin Claro Recitar. I'm Teddy Ostro. Thanks for listening, and catch you next time.